And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you for joining me today and to remind you that all of our content can be found at realtime1960s.com, and if you love what we're doing, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s, support this project, get exclusive access to bonus content, and help us continue to bring you this ongoing portal into the past. That's patreon.com/realtime1960s. And today we reach the end of our journey through my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1964. On 7 previous episodes, we covered films 10 through 2, The Naked Kiss, That Man from Rio, The Pawnbroker, Goldfinger, The Soft Skin, Nothing But a Man, A Hard Day's Night, 7 Days in May, and A Fistful of Dollars. And today, we finish with film number 1. So without further ado, the best of 64 at the movies, right now. And the title of my number 1 film for 1964, the 7th of just 13 films directed by Stanley Kubrick, and his final production shot in black and white, the title went through many incarnations. First, it was Red Alert, after the 1958 novel by Peter George on which it is based. Then Edge of Doom, The Delicate Balance of Terror. These titles were created during the project's initial phase, when it was intended to be a straight nuclear war thriller. But then, after Kubrick decided instead that it would be a nightmare comedy, a new spate of titles reflected that shift. Wonderful Bomb, then Dr. Doomsday, or How to Start World War III Without Even Trying, and finally, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. The How to Stop Worrying formulation was derived from Dale Carnegie, a famous American self-improvement guru who wrote one of the best-selling books of all time, published in 1936, How to Win Friends and Influence People, but whose 1948 follow-up to that book was called How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. So even before seeing the first frame of this film, the title reveals its mode of expression. Unconventional, sarcastic, irreverent, and shot through with gallows humor. Speaking of the first frame, the first thing you actually see is a disclaimer, which begins, "It is the stated position of the U.S. Air Force that their safeguards would prevent the occurrence of such events as are depicted in this film." Now, many viewers and critics assumed that this too was sarcastic, that Kubrick was really saying just the opposite. In fact, this disclaimer, whether true or not, was not written by Kubrick, but added by Columbia Pictures after the film was cut, as a kind of goodwill gesture to the Pentagon, which offered no cooperation for this film, but was being knocked about at this time by several Hollywood productions. 7 Days in May, Failsafe, The Bedford Incident, all of which portray the U.S. military as either fascistic, incompetent, or insane, or in the case of today's film, all of the above. Now, despite the fact that Dr. Strangelove was based on Red Alert, Kubrick's interest in nuclear war predated his awareness of that novel. Starting in the late 50s, he had become increasingly concerned, virtually obsessed, with the topic of nuclear war, and typically, for this largely self-educated and intellectually voracious individual, he read at least 50 books on the topic, one of which, On Thermonuclear War by physicist Herman Kahn, he read 6 times in 1961, the year of the Berlin crisis. But while Kubrick was working on Lolita, he stumbled upon Red Alert and felt that this fairly realistic novel, Peter George, the author, had been a navigator and lieutenant with the Royal Air Force, that it offered a simple enough framework to make a good suspense film. The plot of the novel deals with deranged and terminally ill U.S. Air Force General Quinton, renamed Jack D. Ripper in the film and portrayed ingeniously by Sterling Hayden. But Quinton, of his own volition, sends a squadron of nuclear bombers to get in a first strike at the Soviet Union, an action which commences a race against time, to recall the planes and avert Armageddon, as the Soviets are in possession of a so-called doomsday device. Now, that's the basic plot of the film as well, but Kubrick made several changes. The ending, which I won't reveal, is one. The shift to nightmare comedy is another. A third is the addition of the character Dr. Strangelove, who, despite the fact that he gives the film its title, does not appear until about two-thirds of the way in, and actually has the least screen time of the three characters played by Peter Sellers, the other two being a British exchange officer from the Royal Air Force and the President of the United States. But Strangelove, one of the film's most brilliant creations, is a wheelchair-bound scientist and former Nazi who is now serving as a nuclear analyst/advisor to the president. But this character appears nowhere in the book. And one final change made by Kubrick involves the so-called doomsday device possessed by the Soviets. In the novel, the device, which is a set of buried nuclear bombs packed with massive amounts of radioactive material, which, if detonated, would render the Earth's surface uninhabitable for 93 years. In the novel, this device is controlled by humans, Russian leaders who would be forced to make the decision whether or not to set it off in the event of a nuclear attack on their country. But in the film, the doomsday device is set to detonate automatically in the event of such an attack. A critical shift indicating a central point of this and many of Kubrick's other films, that is, the inherent danger that human-created technologies may spin out of control and damage or destroy the very humans who created them. You see this with HAL the supercomputer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and you also see it in the experimental psychological conditioning technique used in A Clockwork Orange, which prevents violent behavior but has dehumanizing side effects. Now, it's been a matter of contention which portions of the film's dialogue come from Kubrick's earlier, more serious drafts, and which came from author/hipster Terry Southern, who worked with Kubrick for a few weeks in late '62, and who would go on from this film to serve as a kind of link between the counterculture and Hollywood, working on a number of scripts including The Cincinnati Kid, Casino Royale, Easy Rider, several others. But Southern's trademark, a kind of free-flowing, irreverent satire with strong sexual or scatological overtones, is all over this film. From the characters' names, General Buck Turgidson, for example, based on Curtis LeMay and played with great masculine vigor by George C. Scott, to the aforementioned Jack D. Ripper, named after the infamous sex murderer, and then Colonel Bat Guano, played by Keenan Wynn. The list goes on. And yes, it's a juvenile brand of humor, but when applied to these pompous military and political characters, the kind of characters who'd been portrayed with such reverence by Hollywood during World War II and the post-war era, it is a refreshing change of pace. And then there are sexual overtones in the visual imagery as well. The opening titles depict what appears to be warplanes fornicating. Kubrick was able to obtain stock footage of these planes suggestively bobbing and bumping, penetrating and disconnecting as fuel is transferred, which with the kind of dentist office mood music version of Try a Little Tenderness playing on the soundtrack is pretty hilarious. But most of the film's humor derives from the dialogue. One of my favorite exchanges is between General Turgidson, the Scott character, and President Muffley, who is loosely based on Adlai Stevenson. They're in the War Room, which is a fantastic set by Ken Adam, whose work on Dr. No had caught Kubrick's attention. But Scott, sitting at this gigantic table with a binder next to him called World Targets in Megadeaths, is discussing the potential outcome of a preemptive nuclear war launched by the U.S. on the Soviet Union, which, now that Ripper has let the horse out of the barn with his insane directive, Turgidson proposes finishing the job. This is before the Soviet ambassador has revealed the existence of the doomsday device. So first, Scott says, it is necessary now to choose between two admittedly regrettable, but nevertheless distinguishable post-war environments. One where you get 20 million people killed, the other where you get 150 million people killed. And then when the president, who's a fairly weak figure, but virtually the only sane character in the film, says, "You're talking about mass murder, General, not war," Scott replies, "I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed tops, depending on the breaks." Actually, that exchange, where mass casualty statistics are recited with a kind of a cavalier detachment as a numerical abstraction, recalls a less extreme but still disturbing sequence in Paths of Glory, probably Kubrick's best film before this one, where a glory-seeking French general in World War I orders a regiment to do the impossible, to capture an impregnable position, totally defended by the Germans, an effort which of course fails, upon which this ambitious general orders a court-martial for cowardice of any 100 of the soldiers, chosen totally at random, with the penalty being death. This is based on a true event, by the way, that happened in 1915. Now, he's talked down from 100 to 3, again chosen at random, who are indeed executed. After which this general, played by George McReady, says, "I've never seen an affair of this sort handled any better. The men died wonderfully." Both situations, this and the War Room, expose tightly ordered military systems led by inhuman human beings in the top ranks, callously indifferent to the deaths of innocent people. Something else that these two films have in common: brevity. Paths of Glory is just 88 minutes, Strangelove 94, although the first cut was quite a bit longer, and included a massive pie fight at the end in the War Room, which didn't work at all and ruined the structure. Kubrick called it a disaster of Homeric proportions. So he cut that and the film overall down to the bone, which to me was wise, as the characters aren't so much flesh and blood people as ludicrous and fairly unsympathetic caricatures. And there are a couple of sequences, for example, an extended reading off and execution of various commands on the B-52, which is fairly dull and probably could have been cut down. Kubrick was fascinated by processes. We see this in his early film The Killing, a 1956 film noir, which is really a clinical dissection of a racetrack robbery, and then, of course, much more extensive processes aboard the spacecraft in 2001. Now, in that film, those long sequences of astronauts performing various technical functions help create the kind of stately adagio tempo of that film, one of its calling cards. But here, that segment on the B-52 threatens to stall a substantially quicker overall tempo. But the film's virtues are substantial. First and foremost, it is very original. It's also exciting, refreshingly irreverent, exceedingly well acted, especially by Sellers, Scott, Sterling Hayden, and Slim Pickens, and beautifully lit. Lighting was a lifelong fascination and major strength of Kubrick's. There are no major flaws in the film. Minor flaws, well, not flaws, but minor reasons why some may not respond to the film as strongly are, first of all, it is historically dated. For example, the insane General Ripper, during a rant early in the film, says that fluoridation of our drinking water, a practice that began in 1945 under President Truman, is part of a larger communist plot. So to many, this may sound just like random insanity. But there was an actual conspiracy theory in the late 40s and 50s that fluoridation was part of a far-reaching plot to impose a socialist or communist regime in this country. These extremists somehow connected fluoridation with Truman's push for what those people viewed as socialized medicine, what became Medicare and Medicaid 20 years later. But despite the fact that this and a few other references may not connect, there's nothing in the film that would lose less historically aware viewers entirely, as the plot is fairly straightforward. Now, another potential turnoff, not for me, but maybe for some, would be the film's tone, its attitude, which is fairly cold. Yes, it's against the idea of a nuclear holocaust, obviously, but the characters are so absurd, so self-deluded, that you can almost hear Kubrick saying, well, if they do blow themselves to smithereens, no great loss. But you do find that coldness in much of the director's other work, especially his later films, 2001, A Clockwork Orange, certainly, and Full Metal Jacket. It's not that he was incapable of warmth. There's a very sentimental sequence, for example, at the end of Paths of Glory, where a captured German woman, played by Kubrick's soon-to-be wife, is forced to sing on a stage for French soldiers, who at first mock and humiliate her, but then are moved to tears by her plight and their own. And then Barry Lyndon, probably my favorite of Kubrick's films, has some incredibly moving scenes, especially those dealing with the death of Ryan O'Neal's son. There's a funeral procession in that film, accompanied by the music of Handel, that always gives me chills. Kubrick had a genius for musical soundtracks. But as with many brilliant artists and filmmakers of the mid-20th century, Sam Peckinpah, Kubrick's almost exact contemporary, comes to mind. He did have a cynical, some might say clear-eyed view of our species, and tended to focus more on our flaws than our virtues. And at times, his films border on the misanthropic. But to be fair, to a man whose formative years saw the Great Depression, World War II, the Holocaust, the birth of nuclear weapons, and the Cold War, these flaws were very much in evidence, magnified on a global scale. But what's fascinating about Kubrick, despite the philosophical and to some extent visual touchstones shared by many of his films, he tackled, very much on his own terms, an incredible variety of genres and subject matter, from war films of vastly different eras, to film noir, to historical epics like Spartacus and Barry Lyndon, to sex comedy with Lolita, and then of course science fiction, but always applying with laser-like intensity his substantial intellect, his virtual mania for research, and his great technical expertise to all these various projects, which for the most part succeeded, both artistically and commercially. Strangelove, which cost less than $2 million to make, brought in over 5 times that much at the box office, and won critical raves not just here, but all over the world when it was released in early '64. It was supposed to have been released in '63, but the preview screening was scheduled inauspiciously for November 22nd, 1963. So once Kubrick heard the news from Dallas that day, he immediately canceled the screening, and he and Columbia agreed to withhold the release until January out of respect for the Kennedy assassination. The film received 4 Oscar nominations: Best Picture, Director, Adapted Screenplay, and Best Actor for Sellers, winning none of these categories. The fact that it wasn't even nominated for Best Cinematography or Best Art Direction is a joke. My Fair Lady won both those categories as well as Best Picture. But it did win Best Film at the British Academy Awards, and Kubrick won Best Director at the New York Film Critics Awards. Kubrick, one of the trailblazing giants of world cinema, never won a Best Director Oscar, which is of small importance in the larger scheme of things, but I do enjoy pointing out now and then the absolute stupidity of the so-called Academy. Other directors who never won that award, by the way, include Alfred Hitchcock, Howard Hawks, Sidney Lumet, Orson Welles, David Lynch, Fellini, Tarantino, Kurosawa, Chaplin, Leone, Ingmar Bergman, and several other leading lights. So Stanley, you're in good company. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the first installment of a brand new series covering the top 10 films of 1965. So take care, and I'll see you soon.